Welcome everyone to week number 4 of research methods. And this week we're looking at qualitative research, getting a feel for the issue and to the root of the problem. So what's up this week? As per usual, looking at a couple of stories that were in the news, and then getting into qualitative research. So pros and cons, interviews, focus groups, and just a few final thoughts on conducting qualitative research. First off, in the news, Zuji survey. Zuji is an online provider of hotel rooms. Zuji survey exposes hotel guest secrets. So Zuji conducted a survey of many of its users and discovered that bunch of things about their users. Things like 70% admitted to spending up to 10 minutes trying to figure out a hotel shower, and that at least a quarter of them had had parties in their hotel rooms. So, good way to understand what's going on with your guests. U.S. Airways, flight attendants nix contract offer. And essentially, when U.S. Airways and Southwest merged, there was a bunch of contract decisions between the two groups, and the flight attendants have nixed the possible merging of some of the contracts. So who knows where that's going. And bit of research looking into the airline alliances and who they're actually good for, whether they're good for the airlines, customers, or possibly no one. So just some interesting things going on, things for you guys to be looking out for. Anyways, okay, qualitative research. Now, as a reminder, qualitative research tends to be much more descriptive, uses a lot more just general descriptive words, but tries to stay away from the uses of percentages and things like that. Because generally, if you're talking about qualitative research, you're talking about a limited number of actual responses, but much more in-depth, much closer, much greater understanding of individual perspectives rather than group perspectives. Now, if you're conducting qualitative research, quite often, and this is from personal experience, you'll run into a lot more resistance or distrust of qualitative research because a lot of people have trouble understanding it. It's not considered scientific enough and a bit too subjective. And this can be everyone from any of your industry people to some academics have this belief that qualitative research is not scientific enough. So just prepared, if you are planning on doing some qualitative research, you may receive a lot of resistance. But qualitative research can be very useful to provide a lot of in-depth understanding, a great deal of explanation to understand some of the whys behind the research. The quantitative may give you the what's happening, but sometimes that qualitative understanding, the whys, is really important. Now, qualitative research structures. You're really talking about 3 different levels or forms, 3 different ways of looking at qualitative research. And you've got your fully structured qualitative research, which is, as the name suggests, very structured, very set out. As much as possible, all of the questions that are going to be asked, and even many of the probes, and I'll discuss in a few moments about probes and things like that, will be set out. And as an interviewer, you know essentially right from start to finish how that interview is going to go. Semi-structured dials that back a little bit so that it's a little more relaxed, a little less predetermined as far as where it's going to go. You may have most of the questions set out, but the order or the exact way that you're going to do it could vary depending upon how the interview or how the research goes. And your final stage, or your final structure, is completely unstructured, where you've got some general ideas, areas of interest, but much of it is still very open and leaves it open for the interviewer to guide the direction of the research. Now, as expected, each one of them has kind of their own purposes and their own strengths and weaknesses. Important to understand, though, is that the less structured you get, the more skilled the interviewer has to be. And the less likely you want to use that sort of structure if there's more than one interviewer, because you can't guarantee that your interview on your research will go the same way with each individual. So you're really talking about, if you're going to go unstructured, it's really got to be just one interviewer doing all of the work. When might you use qualitative research? Well, quite often you're going to use that qualitative research to get a bit more of that personal perspective. As we talked about earlier, emic versus etic. Getting the perspective more in depth and more from the eyes of the person you're talking to. So you're also trying to go more individual versus group perspective, more individual accounts, and to really explore a topic in much greater depth than you would with quantitative. A lot of exploratory research tends to use qualitative to get that base understanding, and then you go from there to the quantitative research, or the flip side may happen, that you conduct the quantitative research, get some of your percentages, see what's generally happening out there, and then you answer some of those why questions with a little bit of qualitative research. So you can really see how you might use the two of them, quantitative and qualitative, together to get a much better understanding of your phenomenon. Pros and cons of qualitative research, and this is pros and cons in general, so not specific to any type of qualitative research. Some advantages: much more flexible and adaptable generally, because you've got that flexibility to go certain ways and to go where the information takes you. You can generally get much better follow-up information, much better probing information if you're going qualitative, because you're probably running it yourself in person, and so when a question arises, you can go with it. You can much better understand questions as you go. And you can get some very rich and valuable information. Now, disadvantages. Qualitative research quite often is very time consuming. So just be prepared for it. Whereas you might be able to run through hundreds or even thousands of quantitative surveys, quantitative research, respondents in a short period of time. Qualitative research, you're talking more in the ones or the tens of people. Interviewer experience. There's a lot more weight that gets put on the interviewer, because there's a lot more discretion put on the interviewer. Their skills really come more into play. Biases have to be much more carefully watched for, because it's much easier in some respects to lead your respondent. And because it's a bit more free-flowing, that can happen in an instant. The leading and taking your respondent to where you want them to, rather than letting the information go where it needs to. And analyses can be very complex and time-consuming. There sometimes is a real bit of an art to understanding and getting into the heads and getting into the feel of that qualitative information. So, as we've talked, you really have to be careful and let your phenomenon and what you're trying to solve determine whether you use qualitative or quantitative research. Some quick pointers for interviewers. As you might expect, listen more than you speak. Your job as an interviewer is really to just urge and get the person to talk and provide the information. The less you have to say to carry the conversation and to carry things along, the better. Be very clear, straightforward, and non-threatening. Very important also, eliminate any cues which can influence the respondent. And which carries on to the next one, be prepared for anything and guard against making judgments. Sometimes your facial expressions, or you might inadvertently, let a word slip when somebody responds and says something to you that you might not agree with. So, and any responses that you make can affect not only from that answer, but from that point on for the rest of the interview. So just be prepared, be completely non-committal, non-judgmental, and let the respondent act in a completely natural way. Don't show any signs of boredom or lack of interest. You're there to get information from that person. They are the focus of your attention while you're there. So act like it. Act like they're important, because they are. And finally, enjoy your work. A few other things, kind of important pointers, not necessarily while you're there, but to things to think about while you're analyzing or taking a look at some of the information. As a trained interviewer, you need to be watching for not only what's said, but also what's unsaid. What didn't the person talk about? And sometimes that can be as important as what they did say. As well, watch for things that their body is telling you, and the non-verbal cues. Give an example of that. This one interview that my colleague and I were conducting, or one bit of research my colleague and I were conducting up in Banff, looking at the effectiveness of a publication. And so what we did to somewhat simulate the information that these guests were getting at Banff when they drove in, we gave them the entire stack of publications that they would normally get as they entered the park. And we watched to see what they would do, and every one of them ignored completely the publication we wanted them to read and picked up one of the other publications. And what it told us right there was that in this situation, and probably very similar at the park gate, people weren't even going to be reading the publication that we wanted them to if we were giving them that stack as they entered the park. So we realized we really had to change either what we were giving them at the park gate, or possibly change how we were doing it, the publication itself. Something had to change if we really wanted them to get that information. Where possible, you really need to audio or videotape what's going on, and if possible, go with videotaping. That way you as the moderator focus on the focus group. You don't worry about some of the responses and about analyzing it and thinking about everything. You can just focus on the immediate what's going on while you're working on the group. It also allows you to listen to things over again, make sure that you've caught things correctly. It's also great to sometimes go back to the start and listen to what somebody said at the start and then compare that to what they're saying at the end of the focus group or the in-depth interview. Because sometimes what people will say at different points in the interview will change. So if you've got that recording, whether it's audio or audio-visual, it can be very useful for your analysis. And again, as I said, videotapes are the preferred method because it allows you to pick up on some of those non-verbal cues that may occur while you're doing the interview. Of course, before you do any sort of recording, you need to have their permission. And it's best if you get their permission in writing or at least on the audio or videotape, just in case there's any questions that come up later. Interview questions are items. Now, of course, typically you're going to have open-ended questions, and really what you're trying to do is you're just trying to get the respondent to provide as much information about those items as you can. So, as part of it, you really need their cooperation in the whole process. It needs to be very free-flowing, and they need to feel like they're helping you, which they are. Some things to avoid. Avoid any long or confusing statements. If your statement is longer than a sentence, chances are the person is going to lose focus before you get to the end. And at times it may even be useful for you to have some of your questions written down or some options written down so that they can read with you. Okay? But just remember that anything that you want them to read has to be very clear, large enough type that they're not having to strain, and anything that's not necessary on that statement, keep it away. Do not have any double-barrel questions, and this applies not only to qualitative, but also to quantitative research. You don't have two questions in the exact same statement because you're just going to confuse the response, confuse the respondent. Better to split it up and make it simpler. Don't use any jargon, unless it's very specific to the topic and to the respondent. If they're a technical person and you're talking about technical things to them, for example, you might say IT if it's an IT person rather than saying information technology. That's fine, but try not to be technical or too jargony. And do not use any loaded or biased statements. Things, while this is a very obvious one, do you prefer inexpensive hotels in bad neighborhoods, or would you rather pay a little bit more for extra luxury and security? Well, you've essentially loaded the question, suggesting that inexpensive hotels are always going to be in bad neighborhoods. So just be careful how you word and structure your questions. It's also useful for you to think about loaded or biased statements when you're reading the results of somebody else's research and understanding how some of the responses might have been developed or gotten at. Probes and prompts. What's the difference? Well, probes are essentially you trying to get more information out of the person. Trying to get them to better explain a response. Asking them things like, well, why is that important to you? How did that make you feel? Are there any other reasons that you would do that? Prompts, on the other hand, are just like suggested or possible answers. Providing them with a list of some car companies that they might have rented from, or a list of air alliances that they might know, just to get them to start thinking in the right direction that you're trying to head them. Careful with any of this sort of probing or prompting is making sure that you're not, again, leading them down a certain path or suggesting a correct or an incorrect answer. Just be very careful, again, how you get at additional information. Now, typical interview. A typical sequence for conducting an interview, and this can be either, an in-depth interview, one-on-one sort of thing, or group interview, which you might also call a focus group, is your general introduction, and I'll explain some of these a little bit further. A warm-up or icebreaker, the main body of the interview, cooling off, and closure and wrap-up. And one thing I find very useful for my own purposes is that I will actually set up an interview or focus group with all of those headers, along with what I'm generally hoping to get out of each one of those sections, and a set amount of time that I'm planning to spend on each one of those areas of the research, including setting out exactly from the time that I'd be starting the interview, say, 6 p.m. till 8 p.m., and setting out exactly, at 8:05 this should 6:05 this should happen, 6:15 this should be happening, 6:30, so that you have it fairly well structured and you know exactly how you're going to get things to flow throughout the interview. Of course, you're not going to share all of these different stages with the person that you're interviewing, but it does help to keep you more focused and ensure that by the end of that interview and by the end of your research, you're going to get the information you need. Now, start of the interview. That introduction stage is very important because what it does is it kind of sets the tone or the feeling for the rest of the interview. So it's important to do things like very clearly explaining what you're trying to do with the research and why. Telling the person, ensuring their anonymity, emphasizing that there are no right or wrong answers. So making it clear to the person that you're really interested in their responses, their opinion, their ideas, and especially stressing things like it's not important what other people feel, what other people think. Those other people aren't being interviewed. That respondent is, so it's their ideas that really matter. Encourage the respondent to, if they're not sure about a question, to ask, to interrupt, to seek clarification at any point. And also talk about why that respondent is so important to the research, even potentially telling that respondent how they might benefit or others like them might benefit from them helping you. And finally, of course, asking for permission to audio or videotape any of the interview. Just to take a quick step back though, that warm-up and icebreaker. Warm-up and icebreaker is really just a casual way to get into the whole process. It's very general questions just to get the person or the people to start talking. You know, a good way to do that if you're talking about a group interview is to get them to introduce themselves, and then maybe, you know, for example, if you're doing travel research, get them to talk about a trip they last took and really enjoyed. You know, the information isn't necessarily important, just the fact that they're going to speak and get comfortable speaking is very important. Again, main body of the interview is really where you're trying to get the bulk of your information. So the 1, 2, or 3 maybe topics that you're trying to cover. Cooling off period is just some final wrap-up questions, some final thoughts getting from the person. And the closure wrap-up is essentially just concluding the interview, thanking them, making sure that they're okay with all the information that they've provided you, and finding out whether or not there's any questions that came up through it, that through the research, that they want to discuss a little bit further. You know, letting them know what are some further steps in the whole process, things like that. Now, group interviews. Group interviews, as I said, commonly called a focus group. And you've got your moderator or facilitator being the person who manages the whole process. And focus group moderation is a very skilled position, very skilled thing to be able to do. And it's worthwhile, if any of you are thinking about doing focus groups, to get proper focus group training, because it does help do the research. And it is much more difficult than it first seems. You know, it may look like it's just essentially a free-flowing talk, but as that moderator, you need to be listening to everything that's being said, making sure that everyone is contributing, but no one is over-contributing or providing too much of the information and kind of drowning out the views of others. It's important as the moderator to pick up on what people are saying and possibly bring that back into the discussion later on in the process. So someone at the start of the interview might mention something about, you know, this particular hotel that they were very happy with, and later on in the interview you may find the opportunity to reintroduce that topic or that comment or that idea to further explore it. So it's really a full-on sort of process. Some pros and cons of focus groups. Now, your text, of course, has some of these advantages and disadvantages, but just quickly go through some of this discussion. Focus groups can be a very efficient way to get a large amount of qualitative information from several people. So instead of doing a one-on-one interview, you're getting the qualitative or that sort of information from, 6 to 10 people. And, as a quick point, 6 to 10 is kind of an ideal number when you're conducting focus groups. Less than 6, you may not get the sort of discussion going that you're really hoping to with a focus group, and that's part of the things about a focus group, getting that sort of back and forth discussion, people working with each other and feeding off each other's responses, or questioning each other and things like that. Getting more than 10 people can be a bit to manage, and even some people prefer 6 to 8 as being an ideal number. It can be done with more, but you start losing that sort of group dynamic if you get more than 10 people going on. Focus groups are great for providing those sort of checks and balances of the information, so that when somebody makes one comment, somebody else may go, well, actually, I feel a bit different on that topic. So you get a little bit of debating, and sometimes you get that sort of back and forth pros and cons during the discussions. From personal experience, I find that respondents tend to enjoy focus groups if you've structured it and run them properly, because it does have that sort of discussion possibility, and it's much more free-flowing and much more interesting for a lot of people than a straight-up personal interview. And that sort of group dynamic can show what happens in a group. So that's sometimes why it's good for you to run that sort of focus group. Now, some disadvantages of running a focus group. Well, first off, because you've got several people in the room, it's very doubtful that you're going to run through as many questions as you would if it was a single person. So whereas a single qualitative interview, you might go through a dozen questions or more, possibly, in your time with that person. A focus group, you're really limited to the amount of questions that you can ask. 3 to 6 is not unusual for a focus group, because once you get into a discussion with multiple people, you can't cover as many different topics. As a focus group moderator, as I said previously, there's a lot more onus on the moderator to be an expert at running the interview. You need to be very careful that one person doesn't dominate the whole process, because the minute one participant is running it, it's no longer a focus group. It's essentially a one-on-one interview with a bunch of other onlookers. You also need to be very careful to monitor for things like conflict between your participants. And depending upon the topic that you're exploring, you really need to be careful the range and the type of people that you bring into that focus group. Confidentiality can be a bit more of an issue, especially if you're talking about a limited population that you're trying to draw from, smaller town, a smaller group of people from that population, because when you bring them into that room, they obviously know who else is in that room. So they have to be much more vigilant about that, maintaining that confidentiality. And, similar with any qualitative research, you have to be careful how you use that information, and you really shouldn't generalize it across an entire population. You're getting that sort of in-depth understanding of a few people, not the entire population. So care must be taken on how you use that information and report it. So I had previously 6 to 8 participants is a typical number. 10, not unusual. More than 10, you're really pushing it. Under 6, you may not get the sort of back and forth that you really want. Another good heads up if you're running focus group, it's nice to have two skilled or two trained moderators. Only one of them runs the group, mind you, but if you've got two available, two in the room, then that second person can watch for some of those non-verbal cues, some of the other things that are going on. They can help manage things within the group, get certain props when necessary, assist in handing out things like that. That second person can also be very handy if you've got a good working relationship between the two people, to provide, a little bit of feedback or questions, or, help clarify things that might have come up during that interview, rather than having to wait until after the focus group and finding out that, something was mentioned and not followed up on, things like that. So, having that second person there as that second set of ears and second set of eyes can be really handy. One of the things I talked about previously was, making sure that you choose your group carefully, especially when it comes to any sort of controversial issues. And this kind of brings up the whole thing of whether you go with a homogeneous or a heterogeneous group. Whether you have a group that's all similar type people from the same part of that population, or whether you try to mix things up. And, views vary whether you want one or the other. Quite often, if you've got a homogeneous group, then it can sometimes really facilitate communication because they've all got something in common. So when the topic gets brought up, people start discussing a certain item, they can all agree with it, and they can all understand it and appreciate and identify with what's being said. And you can really go in depth with a certain topic, a certain way, a certain type of response. It also provides a certain, sense of security and ease to participants because, they feel like they're with friends or, with like-minded people. So, especially if you've got people that might be a bit shyer about providing their responses, providing their opinions, that's when a homogeneous group might be more advantageous. Now, a heterogeneous group, on the flip side of that, can really, provide fuel to the fire and really get a discussion going. If people are respectful and depending upon the topic, you can get a real debate and a real richness in a different sort of fashion about your topic. And people will work off each other and provide the pros and cons of some of your topics straight away. Now, you need to be careful, though, that it's not too controversial of a topic and that your respondents are completely respectful of each other. Otherwise, things can really get out of control, and next thing you know, you've got a reality talk show. So just be careful how you choose your respondents and what you decide to talk about if you decide to do a heterogeneous group. Some quick final thoughts. Textbook talks about some limitations or potential issues when you're doing focus groups, such as the moderator, especially depending upon their skills, can really affect the results and can really influence the results and really call into question the validity of the information. So that needs to be careful. But But focus groups can also really provide a lot of good information, a good range of responses, but it's not going to tell you, as I said previously, the the range of those responses or how strong those responses are in the population. So again, you never want to try to project your information from your focus group onto a population. You'd never be able to say, well, 50% of my focus group felt this way, so 50% of the population must also feel this way. You can't do that. That's misusing of the information. Okay, so again, think about if you are going to do focus groups or in-depth interviews, think about what sort of information you're trying to get at and how you plan on using that information. And that's it for this week. All right, thank you very much, everybody, and good luck with everything, and I'll see you on the discussion boards.